everyone, to ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the program committee for ICSS Sunday Morning Sessions. We are based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, USA, and our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive weekly announcements for our Sunday sessions. You can also view videos of past presentations and send us a message using our contact form on our website, which again is icssmarks.org. We also want to call your attention to our donation page where you can support our programs. Excuse me. Next week marks 4 years since the Russian intervention in Ukraine, which in retrospect has turned out to be a world-changing event. Our program today is an assessment of the Ukraine war in Trump's first year and the outlook on the war in 2026. Our speaker is Dr. Jack Rasmus, who teaches economics at St. Mary's College of California and is the author of numerous books, including The Source of Neoliberalism, Central Bankers at the End of Their Rope, and forthcoming The Twilight of American Imperialism. He's the host of a weekly radio show, Alternative Visions, and a journalist who writes for numerous publications. He also has a long history of working in the labor movement as a local union president, contract negotiator, and organizer for several unions, including the UAW, CWA, and SEIU. His website is jackrasmus.com. That's jackrasmus.com. And his Twitter handle is at Dr. Jack Rasmus. Dr. Rasmus has spoken many times at our Sunday morning sessions. We'll start, as usual, with a presentation, and after a short break for announcements, a group discussion where you can express your views and ask your questions. There's so much going on right now that we expect to have a pretty lively and informative discussion. So welcome back, Professor Rasmus.
My pleasure. Well, if you're looking at 2025, it's really a picture of failed negotiations by Trump with Russia between the U.S. and Ukraine and EU. It's really a four-party conflict and negotiations going on. On the West side, the NATO side, of course, it's a three-party intra-negotiations between U.S. And in the U.S., you have two fighting factions going on, one the neocons and one Trump trying to find a way out. And then you get the Europeans who really don't want an end to the war. The Europeans, as I see it, are the real problem here. And we'll talk a little bit more why the Europeans want the war to continue. And when I say the Europeans, I mean, the European elites, particularly led by, Macron, Starmer, Merz, and others. In those umbrella organizations called the European Commission, European Council, etc., and of course NATO. All those bureaucratic institutions, the personalities are all interrelated, and they want the war to continue, and that enables Zelensky to pretty much be obstinate about any real negotiations or any elections, etc. A lot of maneuvering going on between the U.S. side and Europeans and Zelensky. Zelensky, has the Europeans at his back, and he's not interested in really any negotiations. On the other side, you got the Russians who have a set of positions since June 2024 as conditions for negotiations, which are totally rejected by Ukraine, backed up by the EU. And Trump is trying to find some intermediate solution here to bring the parties, to some sort of conclusion. He doesn't care what it is; he just wants a conclusion, but he's not going to get it, and we'll talk about the reasons why. But mostly 2025 is a picture of failed negotiations. As you know, Trump bragged during election he'd get an agreement in a day, which is just nonsense. Uh, and in the beginning of 2025, Trump led with the neocon position, as we'll see. And then when that didn't produce anything for the first 6 months, he attempted a new position, which was expressed in the Anchorage, August 2025 Anchorage Agreement, which has totally failed ever since then. Uh, but before we get into more detail in 25, 26, we need to, I think, it would be useful to do a little historical background about how all this conflict originated. Um, it goes back to the failed agreements between Gorbachev and the U.S., particularly James Baker, Secretary of State, back in 91, that the U.S. and NATO would not expand eastward. This is a conflict over NATO, really, and NATO's encroachment on spheres of interest that are, really clearly part of Russia. Back in 91, there's even letters, documents now from Baker and others that explicitly assure Gorbachev that NATO would not move east. In fact, even assured them that NATO would not militarize East Germany. East Germany was the first one when they allowed East Germany to merge with West Germany. Part of that agreement was, yeah, they'd be part of NATO, but NATO would not stage military facilities in East Germany. Of course, that broke down immediately. Uh, by 1994, the U.S. Had made a decision, Clinton had made a decision here that NATO would expand east that early. The actual mechanics of that expansion did not really come in place until uh, Clinton's second term. Then the wheels really began to turn, and by 1999, we had the first expansion of NATO East. That was Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. That was 1999. 1999 is an interesting year, by the way. If you remember your history here, Clinton got impeached, right, by the U.S. House uh, in December of 1998. And he had his trial in the Senate in February of 1999, and he just squeaked by. The Senate did not convict him of the impeachments, which, as we know, I won't go into those, were really incredible. uh, what happened, I believe, over the winter of 98, 99, to protect himself, I believe that Clinton pretty much agreed to whatever, anything that the neocons want. The neocons really took over U.S. foreign policy in 98, 99. It wasn't when Bush came in 2001, too. 1999 is an interesting period, not only because that's the year that NATO first begins moving east. 1999 is the year when Yeltsin, who was president of Russia, um, uh, pretty much abdicates, fires his prime minister, and appoints Putin as the prime minister, and then he resigns right after that, and Putin becomes the president. So, the move east and Putin coming to power are directly linked. The move east of NATO and Putin. You can't separate the two. And that's really, I think, when the conditions of the war really began to uh, establish back there in 99, 2000. 1999 was also the year when the U.S. Gives uh, preferred nation trading rights and agrees to bring China into into the West, the WTO and everything. It's also the year Europe creates the Eurozone. A lot goes on at that time. Clinton deregulates global U.S. finance significantly. The Graham-Piley Act that repeals, other legislation. And it's also the year when the U.S. Plans and begins actions against Al Qaeda and the Taliban. 1999. Yeah, they start going after targeting bin Laden and the Taliban in 1999. So you got to see the attacks on 9/11 and then the war, terrorist war against the Taliban, invasion of Afghanistan and going after the terrorists, etc., is all linked into this critical period. The U.S. really begins the war against Taliban in 19 and the terrorists so-called in 1999. And it's also the year that sanctions intensify against Iran and Iraq, Libya and Syria. So this axis of eagle target that Bush later identifies publicly, it really begins under Clinton. And as a result, you can see that there's a real continuity in U.S. foreign policy, imperialist foreign policy, that begins under Clinton and is just, you know, escalated under George Bush and everything afterwards. Uh, under Bush, the attempt to expand NATO East accelerates. We get the rest of Eastern Europe in 2002 joins NATO. The southern tier there, Romania, Slovakia, and etc., and also in the Balkans. And there is an election, a regime change attempt using electoral CIA intervention and so forth in Ukraine. I think it was 2004, which produces results that are inconclusive in Ukraine in 2004. You have pretty much the country split between pro-Europe and in the Western Ukraine and pro-Russia in the Eastern Ukraine. So that regime change by electoral intervention, manipulation, pretty much does not produce the results they want. Then you get Bush and others talking outright about by 2007 and 8 about we've got to bring Ukraine into and Georgia into NATO. Uh, so the push into Ukraine really comes as a consequence that they couldn't achieve their results electorally in 2004. And at the Bucharest conference of NATO in Europe and U.S., in which Bush attends, they outright declare that NATO, NATO is going to absorb Ukraine and Georgia in the immediate future. And of course, then you get the eruption of the Georgian War, Russia-Georgian War as a result. And that is the first defeat for regime change by various means that the empire experiences, 2008. And then we get the financial crash, and everything is kind of put on hold by the empire a couple years. And then by 2010-11, we have a resumption of regime change operations, Libya and other areas, which is sort of concluded with the coup in Ukraine in 2014, which is clearly a CIA coup. Uh, they had elections in 2013, and those elections showed that there was a continuation of this total split in Ukraine, a pro-West, pro-East. The same thing that occurred in 2004. But the U.S. Neocons, now fully in control, did not want to accept a further continuation of inconclusive results by electoral regime change. So they overturned the election. That's what the coup was all about. Overturn that election and just use third party other surrogates here in Ukraine to really take it over, and they did. Of course, they succeeded in that coup, drove the Russian candidate out of Ukraine. He left Ukraine, and two things happened immediately. One was the West, the U.S. and Europe, uh, then began a deep penetration of the economy of Ukraine, which to this day is a big problem. How do you get a settlement in Ukraine, without compensating all that capitalist interest, European and U.S., that flooded into Ukraine after the 2014 coup. Um, Victoria Nuland rather, who was a number two or three neocon in the U.S. Uh, Pretty much engineered the groups that overthrew the government and the coup. And she was made economic czar in 2014-15 of Ukraine. Even though she was a foreigner, the Ukraine parliament passed a special resolution that said that you didn't have to be a citizen of Ukraine just for her. And she became economic czar of Ukraine after the 2014 coup. And that's when, Western capital really flooded into Ukraine, took over a lot of companies and the best resources and so forth. And so did the Europeans. Um, and we'll see that sort of set in motion a competition and contest later between the European economic interest in Ukraine and American economic interest. It was also this time that uh, you know, tip of the iceberg, Biden's son becomes, very important uh, member of a board of a big energy company in Ukraine. Well, a lot of relatives of American capitalists and their lawyers and so forth uh, penetrated into Ukraine, bought up and sat on boards and so forth. This is something that's often overlooked, that the deep capitalist penetration on the ground in Ukraine is a factor. And it's a quiet, silent factor in inability to uh, resolve through negotiations, because these people want, how are we going to be compensated? How are we going to be compensated for our losses in the East or whatever? And that's how you have to see the minerals deal that Trump in early 25 attempted to create. You call the minerals deal. The U.S. Wanted a share of the future profits of minerals uh, exploitation in Ukraine, right? And the deal was eventually struck. Uh, Not along the terms that Trump wanted. Trump eventually sort of conceded and agreed to a weak deal. But Trump was very much aware that the U.S. under Biden and going back to 2014 had just given hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, given, not loaned. Unlike the Europeans who loaned money to Ukraine over this period and for the war, the U.S. just gave it to them. And estimates, 350 billion. Well, the minerals deal is about trying to get some of that back, you see, and getting back means U.S. companies would be involved in the exploitation of Ukraine resources. Well, the Europeans have, resisted that. They want their share of that, and the Europeans are between an eight ball on that because they've given loans and the lenders have to get paid back, you see. And that's part of the problem of crafting a deal here in negotiations. How are the Europeans investors going to get their money back? Well, that leads to, all the maneuvers and negotiations within the EU over the Russian assets, right? Uh, they see the Russian assets as the way that they're going to get paid back. You may have heard about a recent deal between Ukraine, Zelensky, and the Europeans. in which the Europeans have pledged another $90 billion to Ukraine. Uh, Zelensky wants 800 billion, and they've given him 90 billion. Most of that 90 billion is going to go towards um, production, military production. Ukraine says, we will produce our own military arms because Europe has pretty much run out of military weapons. It mostly gave the old Soviet weapons, and they've blown through all that, and now they have to continue buying U.S. weapons, which Trump is willingly selling them. Uh, but the longer term picture by the European Union, European NATO, uh, is really to have Ukraine produce more of its own weapon systems. However, those weapon systems factories are going to be stationed in Europe. So picture this, $90 billion, we're giving half of that for weapons, over the next 6 to 12 months. But most of that is going to go towards increasing production of Ukraine military weaponry, particularly drones and so forth, in Europe. In Europe. So they're not really giving 90 billion or 45 billion or whatever to Ukraine. They're really going to use that money to build up their own military industrial complex because the picture is Europe is totally unable to produce a war modern war capability weapons production. They've relied on the U.S. for decades now, but now the U.S. has clearly told them, you got to fund your own, right? So as I see it, Europe, the main reasons that Europe does not want an end of the war in Ukraine is propping up as a result Zelensky is that immediately two reasons. One reason is the European economy is in a mess. Okay, it's barely growing, barely growing. It is totally behind the U.S. in terms of new investment and China. It's becoming an economic backwater. Its banking system is archaic. It can't compete with the capital markets in the US and China. It has no presence in the artificial intelligence and next generation technology industry that's going to drive the economies. It's way behind. It has nothing going on there. Its trade with the U.S. Is now on increasing on attractive terms, the 15% tariff increase. The U.S. is selling Europe most of its needs for natural gas and oil, but of course that price is two, three, and four times what the Russians were. So Europe is becoming increasingly dependent on the U.S. economically. Um, and of course, politically, we have the split in NATO, which I think will eventually break up NATO. But the Europeans have to continue the war in Ukraine because that's the justification for telling their own populace we have to expand military production. We have to now develop our own military industrial complex and weapons systems. You see, they can't really impose that draconian economic cost on their own population without the justification of the war. Plus, the European economy just is flat, and military Keynesianism is the answer they see, the elite see, for resurrecting the economy over there in Europe. Uh, so long term, the U.S. is pulling out financially. I don't know if they'll pull out, institutionally from NATO, but financially they want to reduce their presence, U.S. Economic and military presence in NATO, and let the Europeans handle their own task. And so they need the war to justify boosting their economy. They need the war to justify the proposals for remobilizing militarily. I mean, Merz in Germany has said, well, we need $1 trillion over the next 3 or 4 years in order to remilitarize. And they pretty much said that that remilitarization is necessary for the war that they believe is coming with Russia after 2028, 29. So they're preparing for war. They're preparing their economy for war. But to do that, they need to continue the war and keep Zelensky propped up uh, in Ukraine. Uh, that's why there will not be any kind of agreement of any substance here uh, between the U.S. and Russia and Zelensky and the Europeans. It just won't happen. This war is going to go on. The Europeans think, and their generals think, and there's all sort of comments going on that Russia's not winning. After 4 years, they haven't gained very much, and they don't believe militarily the Russia can succeed, uh, and that eventually the Russian economy is going to crack, and or Putin may not be around. So they're planning long term continuing this war. That's the EU elite's position. Keep the thing going, even if it's at a lower grade conflict. Keep it going somehow, and let the Ukrainians die. Estimates range widely about the losses, the manpower losses in Ukraine. Um, some as high as 1 million or more, and others, at least 700,000. Uh, it's very disputable. It's hard to find out exactly how much loss there has been because it's kept pretty much a secret here by Ukraine. But we do know, for example, that the Ukrainian security Internal Information Service has admitted that there's been 300,000 desertions in the Ukrainian forces, but yet they seem to be able to mount counteroffensives. So their reserves have not been totally exploited and destroyed, even though they've lost hundreds of thousands. And then you get the massive propaganda claims that the Russians have lost over 1 million. Uh, uh, so far after 4 years, which is just nonsense because look, the Russian army is 1.4 million. They have 700,000 in Ukraine, so about half of the Russian total military is in Ukraine, but that's 700,000. If they lost over 1 million, that would meant that their entire army has been military has been destroyed in Ukraine, and they somehow created another one in the interim. So a lot of CIA propaganda here, which gets repeated in the U.S. mainstream media here, which the neocons want, because the U.S. neocons are aligned with the Europeans, you see. Uh, and then you have other forces in the U.S., including some people in the Pentagon, who don't want to extend U.S. Weaponry commitments to Ukraine and to Europe any further because the U.S. Stocks of military stocks, particularly missiles, uh, have uh, have been depleted significantly. Uh, so the U.S. is beginning to take a position that we're not only not giving you any more money, you got the 61 billion from Biden before we left uh, in 2025. There's no more forthcoming, and Europe, if you want to provide weaponry to Ukraine, then you got to buy it from the U.S. But even buying it is a problem because the U.S. just does not have the production of certain key weapon systems. And then the U.S. Of course, is preoccupied militarily, particularly navally and Air Force, first in Latin America, Venezuela, and now in the Middle East, which it looks like war is coming for sure. You don't bring three aircraft carrier task force. You don't lock and load without pulling the trigger, right? And of course, Netanyahu's recent visit to Trump is the last stage of the planning for this. So uh, I think there will be war in Iran here. Um, and that points to a bigger picture, and that is the U.S. empire, as I've said repeatedly in presentations, is becoming unaffordable. They can't, as it is structured now, they can't prepare for war or conflict with China, which they're doing. They're pumping all kind of military arms into Taiwan and Japan and elsewhere not right now, although they put that on the back burner. You can't focus on the Western Hemisphere, which is what they're doing under Trump right now, which is the least costly, believe it or not, um, and contain the war or prepare for war and all the expenditures in the Middle East. Because the Zionists pretty much control U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East right now, and continue a war in Ukraine. That's like a forefront military or pre-military conflict. And as I've pointed out in detail in my book, the U.S. as of 2025 fiscal year spent $2.1 trillion on defense, almost a trillion just on Pentagon. But the Pentagon spending is just the tip of the iceberg. We're spending almost 400 billion on veterans affairs and hundreds of billions of dollars on homeland security and CIA and intelligence and so forth. So it's out of control. The interest on the debt alone, deficits caused mostly by tax cuts and war spending. This 2.1 trillion, and then Trump has announced another 400 billion he wants to spend on next fiscal year. So the empire cannot afford, as it's structured, to maintain full commitment in all of these conflict locations, right? And the position of the U.S. is Europe. Ukraine's your backyard. You want it, you pay for it, you fund it, right? Uh, so what you got is Trump trying to find a formula in between the U.S. neocons and the Europeans and Zelensky, who's tailgating them, and the Russians. And that's why you see all these negotiations going on and going nowhere. And they will continue to go nowhere. At first, in 2025, uh, the U.S. Went with the Kellogg plan, General Kellogg, which was really a plan uh, that really called for a freeze first, right? Freeze first, and then negotiations. That's the European uh, Zelensky U.S. neocon position. Freeze first, and then we'll talk, right? And that's Zelensky's position too. I mean, that's really a tactical thing to stop the advances of Russia in the east and remobilize and revitalize Ukraine, its resources here, and prepare for a further conflict. And the Russians have not really fallen for that. They fell for uh, stepping back and a delay in 2015 with the Minsk agreement, right? And then that turned out to be just an attempt to buy time to build the Ukraine military, which was admitted by European leaders. That's what Minsk II was about. And then Putin, uh, trusted negotiations in 2022 uh, in Istanbul. The Russian invasion of 2022 was really just an attempt to intimidate Ukraine to come to some negotiated solution. I mean, you can't invade along what 1,000-mile front there with 90,000 combat troops. That's all that initial invasion was, 90,000. Impossible. But it succeeded in bringing Ukraine to the table. And in April, there was a tentative agreement, April 22, uh, to to have some sort of settlement uh, in which the eastern provinces, they call them oblasts, eastern provinces in the Donbass and Zaporozhye and other places, uh, Kherson, would at least remain under Ukraine, but be given certain autonomy and rights, but it would remain part of Ukraine. This was in April 22, but as we know, NATO, uh, the UK and the US pretty much, quashed that. Boris Johnson, then PM of UK, flew in and said, pretty much convinced Zelensky, no, no, don't agree to this deal. We're going to build your military, and you can continue taking it over militarily, take over that east militarily. Uh, and that's what happened. And in the fall, early fall of 2022, Ukraine, with NATO backing, launched an attack on Russian forces, which were insufficient, and Russia had to retreat to the Donbass and across the Dnieper River here to the south. Um, and it looked like, they were going to prevail. They, meaning EU, uh, Ukraine, NATO was going to prevail. But the Russians dug in and then remobilized, and we had, conflicts back and forth here. Uh, for a while, it looked like there was an offensive in the Kursk region that the Ukraine was going to have some success, but they were eventually driven back out of that, and it's been pretty much a slog ever since in the war. Um, Russians gaining, very slowly but very steadily gaining ground here in the east in various places, but it's not been easy. And It's been difficult because the nature of war has changed, you see, because of the new technologies, particularly drone technologies and hypersonics and so forth, that it's changed. And it's very difficult to mount massive uh, armored columns attacking, as in World War II. You'll never see that again because of the new technologies. So most of the offensives on by the Russians, have been either battalion or smaller, company size, platoon size, uh, you know, sort of penetration, and then you lock up an area and you bring up more troops, and then you penetrate with small forces going forward. And That's one of the reasons why the gains have been slowly coming in the east by Russia. The other reason I believe that the Russians have not immediately prevailed is that the special military operation is too small. There's no way you can conquer unless all of Ukraine up to the Dnieper River, unless uh, the Ukraine army completely implodes. And there's yet no signs of that, although there's great stresses going on, ability to mobilize and draft more, and at the same time, you know, provide forces that can prevail in the Donbass. Um, uh, so far, it appears that Ukraine still has reserves, you see. Uh, Ground warfare is primarily a question of concentration of forces. Whoever can concentrate more forces at a particular point generally prevails. And the SMO at 700,000 is not sufficient as long as the Ukraine forces, three, four, or 500,000. That's significant still, and they still can find reserves somewhere and counter offensives that don't sustain, but yet slow down and blunt Russian offensives. Um, if you look at World War II, how large a force did it take the Soviets to take back Ukraine? 3 million. They had 3 million against a German force which was not as strong as it once was. They eventually took Ukraine, but it took a huge number of forces. I don't think SMO at 700,000 is sufficient. Um, it's just probably sufficient uh, to take back the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, you know, and maybe even Zaporozhye. But it's not sufficient to go all the way to the Dnieper River, which is obviously going to be necessary because there's going to be no negotiated settlement here. The Kellogg Plan was really a fake negotiations, um, but the real negotiation potential appeared with the Anchorage Agreement, where Putin flew to Anchorage, Alaska, to meet with Trump. We don't know the terms of that agreement, but the Russians are alleging that there was a deal reached, a conclusion on terms of ending the war reached between Russia and Trump, Putin and Trump. We don't know those details, but they little vestiges, little pieces of it have appeared, um, and that includes some kind of the U.S. dropping for the first time freeze first. Apparently, the U.S. Had a new position that, okay, let's negotiate before a freeze, which was the Russian position. You see, the Russian position was set forth in June of 24 by Putin, where Putin clearly said that those four new oblasts, which are now part of Russia because they had a referendum there in late 2022, and those oblasts became Russia. And Russia is not going to ever back off on that because now it's in their constitution. And by the way, it's in the Ukrainian constitution not to give up any land. So one of those constitutions are going to have to be changed before you got a settlement, but neither look imminent that that's going to happen. Um, so, you don't have the forces, and negotiations in Anchorage now have broken down, whatever that deal was. And despite the fact the U.S. backed off of freeze first, and the U.S., of course, is Trump teams, Witkoff and others have been meeting repeatedly with Russia, with sometimes even with Putin. Witkoff, at one point spent like 3 hours with Putin in Moscow. Right, this is a back channel in which the Europeans have been excluded and Ukraine has been excluded. Um, so, the U.S. is conducting this separate track of negotiations with Russia uh, and enticing Russia with all kinds of economic deals, proposals, including lifting sanctions and so forth, uh, and continuing to negotiate separately. And the Europeans and Zelensky, of course, are freaking out over that because they don't want any negotiated settlement, as I said, and they would disrupt everything, including the economic details of negotiations. And that's the picture we've had since Anchorage. The Europeans and Zelensky, kept out of the picture, and the U.S., you know, going forward with some kind of a negotiations, probably more on a non-Ukraine war topic. So that's clearly also included. Excuse me. Uh, but at the same time, that the U.S. is conducting this separate track of negotiations, it is not giving any indication that it's in favor of ending the war either, because right after the Alaskan negotiations began, the U.S. Intensifies its sanctions. It placed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, the big Russian oil companies. It put pressure on Europe to really stop all of Russian natural gas imports, which they were continuing, by the way, throughout, despite previous sanctions, throughout the whole picture. So you get intensified negotiate sanctions that occur. Then you get this attacking of Russia, its oil fleet, the oil, I forget what they call that fleet, but independent oil tankers and so forth, the shadow fleet, as they call it. direct seizure of at sea, which is an indication that the sanctions, otherwise sanctions are not working that much. So now they're seizing ships. At the same time, they're really targeting India and putting pressure on India not to buy any more Russian oil. That would make a big dent in Russian oil sales. And it's unclear whether uh, India has agreed to that. At first, they clearly said no. Uh, and then apparently, according to claims of U.S. legacy media, that they have, and it's hard to tell whether that's propaganda on the part of Trump in the U.S. But they're targeting secondary sanctions against other countries here. And India is, the big target of that. So you got the seizure of Rosneft and Lukoil. You got targeting India. You got the seizure of Russian tankers, oil tankers. And then you have what happened at the end of December, very clearly a CIA operation, CIA Ukraine is, security services, which are one and the same operation, in which they sent drones to attack Trump's one of Trump's residences in Valdai, Russia. Yeah, they attacked it with drones, which is really a real escalation and really upset the Russians and Putin. And then, of course, we've had the assassinations of Russian generals going on in Moscow, the last of which, this guy Alexeyev, was on the negotiating committee with the U.S. and Ukraine, Russian side of the negotiating committee. So you've got neocon interests in the U.S. and in Europe intensifying, trying to provoke and intensify the conflict as negotiations are underway on a separate track between Russia and and uh, in the U.S., right? Which leads me to the position that I think the negotiations are a deception. I don't think there's any intent at an agreement. They are deceptions, and all U.S. negotiate imperial negotiations in the 21st century are a deception, in my opinion. There was what's been going on several times with Iran, right? I mean, those are deceptions. It's to buy time to get the military forces in place or other maneuvers, political, that are being planned. And that's why I think all this negotiations and Trump and the media sort of puff it up that, oh, maybe a deal is possible. It's all about luring the other side, thinking that maybe a deal is possible. But when the U.S. sends 3 aircraft carrier task forces, you know what's going to happen. You know, and the same thing happened in Venezuela. And the Rodriguez regime thinks that they can negotiate a deal with Trump here to just give him the oil. No, Trump has not really sent in the Marines because he thinks he can get what he wants now that he's totally intimidated the Venezuelan, what's left of the government. He sees that his final results are going to be the elections that the U.S. and CIA will stage and totally take over the government this spring. He doesn't have to risk, the blowback from troops on the ground in Venezuela. He's going to get his way. And, the Rodriguez government knows if they think that they could somehow cut a deal, they're really deluding themselves. And the same thing with the Iranians. I don't think the Iranians are falling for it anymore. But all the negotiations are really a deception. And I believe the negotiations in Ukraine are in Russia and the track is a deception here. I don't think
Yeah.
the U.S. really uh, plans to uh, get out of Ukraine in the war unless the Russians want to capitulate. The U.S. plan and strategy is let the Europeans take over the task, and we'll sell them all the weapons they want, right? And then when a deal eventually is reached in Ukraine, the U.S. is going to take the lion's share of the reconstruction benefits. right? That's what the minerals deal was initially about, right?
So, Jack, we have actually some questions coming up in the chat. Why don't we shift over to the Q&A at this point? Do you have
Okay,
any
okay,
final words you want to put in?
yeah. Let me just wrap up,
Yeah.
summarize here. Uh, First point, there's not going to be an end to this war by negotiations, first of all. Second, Europe needs the war to continue and will keep that war continuing one way or another. They're planning for a bigger NATO war after they militarize in two to 3 years, right? Negotiations are a deception tactic. U.S. neocons are still in control of U.S. foreign policy and are pretty much deep state, pretty much is manipulating Trump, who flip-flops back and forth between positions, and he's pretty much under control. And I believe uh, we're going to see some changes here in the European governments. Here, Starmer is gonna go the way pretty soon. Macron is going to follow within a year. Merz is going to be the Europe leader of this whole campaign in Ukraine. So that's my analysis. And Russia, if is going to prevail, we'll have to prevail militarily. We'll have to add, in my opinion, at least 400,000 or 500,000 more troops on that front. Otherwise, it's just going to be a slog back and forth. They're not going to be able to prevail. Maybe in Donetsk, but not anywhere else, and certainly not going all the way to the Dnieper River, which is what they're going to have to do if they militarily want to end this thing. And that's, I think, the debate going on in Russia right now. But they're going to have to commit more forces. The SMO is not sufficient to militarily prevail conclusively in Ukraine.
Okay. Thank you very much. After a few short announcements, we'll have questions and comments from participants. To ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button, raise hand at the bottom of your Zoom window. Let's keep questions short, ask one question at a time to allow everyone to participate. And keep in mind that this is a comradely forum for political discussion. Please show respect to other participants and the moderator of today's session. Upcoming programs at Sunday morning at the Marxist Forum on February 22nd next week, 10:30 a.m. Pacific time again. We're going to have an interesting sessions, reflections on contradictions in China based on traveling in Chinese cities. The speaker is going to be Dr. Amit Singh. Based on his personal experiences traveling in China with his partner and child, Dr. Singh will present his observations, stories, and interesting encounters from his trip. He will highlight contradictions in Chinese society and will focus on the present state of the Chinese economy, education, health, and other parameters. The talk will also dwell on how to characterize China, which is sometimes characterized alternatively as capitalist, state capitalist or market socialist, semi-peripheral, imperialist, or semi-colonial, oppressed or oppressor. Dr. Singh has a PhD in mechanics from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, where he was involved in anti-war and labor organizing efforts in Minneapolis. Currently, he's on the faculty at IIT Bombay, India, where he's involved in the struggles around working class and caste issues and resistance to attacks on academic freedom and national minorities. This should be a very interesting, informative, and lively session. We want to remind you that you can sign up for email notifications for future programs at icssmarks.org, where you can find links to video recordings of our past programs. Contact us with feedback, suggestions for future programs and topics, and make a donation to support our Sunday morning sessions. Okay, and with that, what we're going to do is let's go ahead and start with some questions. I'll start with Richard Wright. If you would kindly lower your hand and unmute yourself. Richard Wright. Okay, let's actually go to Daniel. Well, hold on, Richard. Let's go to Daniel Borgstrom. So Daniel, please unmute yourself.
Okay, Daniel Borgstrom here.
Thank you.
One comment and one question. The comment is the 30 Years' War, which ravaged Europe in the 1600s. Uh, During then, they had negotiations which went on, I believe they went on for over a decade. I just wanted to toss that out. Now, my question is this. Um, Russia has apparently said that they will furnish oil to Cuba. Uh, I haven't seen any evidence of that yet. Are they going to, or will they, or any any opinion on that? Uh, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, well, like yourself, it's unclear to me whether that's actually happening. Uh, I don't think Russia has announced it yet, if it is, and it's not clear whether that's just a excuse being raised by the neocons to increase the pressure on Cuba. Should they do that, it will be interesting to see whether we have a repeat of 62 and the blockade by the U.S. Navy of Cuba if Russia attempts to send tankers. But I really don't know any more about that particular topic than you do at this point.
Okay, next let's go with Francis Lawrence. If you would unmute, please. Go ahead, Francis.
Hi. Um, could you comment on the opposition to Western support for Ukraine that may or may not exist in Europe, both from the right wing perspective and also from the socialist left? Alexander Mackay has been on this platform from the UK, but he represents quite a minority, I think, of socialists in the UK. So if you can comment that, I'd appreciate it. And also, to what extent does the Arctic figure into the equation?
Well,
Thank you.
on the first part of your question, I don't think the opposition is that deep in Ukraine, but it is pretty deep in Germany. The German parties, AfD and the left, you know, which is reformulating in a number of ways, are adamantly opposed to further participation of Germany and Europe in Ukraine. Uh, Now, the AfD in particular has been gaining a lot of votes, and if they had a vote tomorrow, probably the AfD, would have the majority of the vote, because people realize in Germany that their economic situation is directly related, which has been deteriorating significantly, is directly related to the war. And there's a lot of opposition to remilitarize Germany by significant sections of the German population, but particularly the AfD and then the left party.
Francis, if you could mute, I think we're getting an echo. If you go ahead, go
Oh,
ahead, Jack. Thank you.
Oh,
yeah,
Okay,
okay, it was on the other end. Okay,
yeah.
yeah. As I was saying, just summarize briefly here. The AfD, which is probably the majority party now, is adamantly opposed to further involvement in the Ukraine war, and also on the left, other newer parties are opposed to it, and a significant part of the German population does not want to uh, continue this war, and certainly does not want to go to war with Russia here, because that's the German elite, Merz and some of these other guys' plan here. As I said, very clearly, they've said, well, and German generals have said by 2028, 29, maybe 30 at the latest, we have to prepare for war with Russia. That's what they're saying. And hysteria in Europe that's being promoted by the legacy media in Europe that, oh, the Russians are coming is very intense. And they're trying to whip up public opinion for that. But I don't think that that's really going to succeed, particularly if these politicians eventually get dumped. We'll see, whether the next year or two that might interrupt the whole thing. Certainly, Macron would not win if there were an election tomorrow, and UK is a basket case politically as well as economically. Who knows how that's going to turn out? But in Germany, it's the Merz elites who want the war versus majority of the population. And those elites have come out and said point blank, we will never let the AfD take government. They will never let the AfD assume through an election a majority control of the German government. So that's very interesting. Well, we'll see what happens. But as far as your second point, I didn't quite understand what you were getting at. You want to clarify that?
Yeah, Trump has indicated his interest in the Arctic, and that's access to the Arctic is a strategic goal of the U.S. And obviously Russia could control much of the Arctic. So I was asking, to what extent does that figure into the long-term strategic thinking of the West?
Oh, that's very significant for U.S. Trump strategic thinking. That's what Greenland's all about. That's what taking Greenland's about. That's what intimidating Canada, insulting Canada is about, because the U.S. Is engaged in a crash program to build bases in the Arctic. Right now they only have Alaska. They want the Ukraine, and then they need Canada to put more money into developing bases in the Canadian North. Canada's been dragging its heels on doing that. And it's interesting that the first meeting that occurred between Carney and Trump some time ago, Carney came out and announced the significant Canadian reinvestments in military bases in the North. So that's what it's about here. And the U.S. is really planning, because as you say, the Russians have significant bases across its Arctic landmass there. And it's very short distance going over, the Arctic Ocean to the U.S. The Russians have like 40 or 50 advanced icebreakers. The U.S. has two. And
Exactly.
they're attempting to get the South Koreans to build more icebreakers for the U.S. In a crash program here right now. That's part of spending money on naval construction here in the budget, Trump's budget. So yeah, it's very critical. And of course, we've seen the conflicts between Europe and the U.S. over Greenland. Trump's going to get Greenland, hook or crook, one way or another. And all this tentative agreement is just buying time for the U.S. to build up its position in Greenland. Even this deal with the Europeans, I think Rutte, the head of NATO, negotiated a quote pause here in the escalating conflict between Europe and the U.S. over Greenland. But even this temporary agreement allows the U.S. to build as many bases as it wants in Greenland, and those bases would not be leased. They would be U.S. sovereign territory perpetually. That would be part of the U.S. And the U.S. could build those bases anywhere and as many and anywhere that it may want. And the same goes with mining operations. It could say, "Oh, we like this mining. There's rare earths here, whatever. We're going to claim this particular real estate as U.S. sovereign property, and we're going to expand bases." So I see the strategy of Trump to expand these bases everywhere, increase U.S. influence, maybe have the population in Ukraine of U.S. bases greater than the 40,000 citizens in Greenland, and then pull the trigger on some political maneuver here to bring Greenland as part a protectorate into the U.S. That's priority for him, and I think he's going to prevail one way or another.
Okay, next is Richard, followed by Citizen One. So go ahead, Richard. Right.
Thank you very much. Pardon me. I wanted to sort of preface my question here with a little something, and that is that for most of my adult life, I have been pro the abolishment of NATO. I find myself sort of in conflict now with that because, and then here this gets to my question. I was wondering if you could address the recent Munich summit on security, where the Democrats are going there and the Republicans are apparently shying away from it, where it appears that the Republicans are basically pro of the abolishment of NATO, and the Democrats are there to continue it. And so I was wondering if you could just sort of address that conflict, that apparent contradiction for me. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the Munich Agreement is a reflection of European strategy.
I'm sorry.
And
I was talking about the recent security arrangement in Munich that happened. It may be happening or it might have happened last week or maybe going on right now.
yeah, well, I was about to
Oh,
comment
okay.
on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the focus is a security agreement, a Europe-wide
Right.
security agreement here, and I see that as a way of blocking any resolution to Ukraine, because what the Europeans are saying is that Russia has to give us a security arrangement, and in that European security agreement, they're planning to bring Ukraine into that. So it's kind of like a de facto Article 5. You know, you have a European-wide security agreement. Ukraine's in the security agreement, and that means that at least the European NATO countries will defend Ukraine if it's continued to be attacked. It's a surrogate solution to bringing Ukraine into NATO. And it's also an attempt to justify European remilitarization, as part of a security. We got a security agreement, we got to remilitarize here to back up the security agreement. Now, Russia wants a security agreement too, uh,
Right.
but that's not what the Europeans are thinking about you know. But by talking security agreement, they're sort of talking the language of the Russians, and it gives them an opportunity to appear defensive, I think. But it's a de facto way of throwing a wrench in the works of negotiations and the whole ultimate objective of bringing Ukraine into NATO.
Okay, the number of questioners keeps growing despite the fact that we're ticking them off one by one. So please try to keep your questions focused on the topic and ask one question at a time. So we'll have Citizen One followed by Raj Sahai. So Citizen One, please go ahead.
Yes, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had that problem a month ago with my audio. Uh, I just want to say that if the U.S. were to get into a full-out war with Iran, uh, and if the U.S. lost one or maybe a couple of aircraft carriers to advance Ukrainian missiles, then China would be the reigning naval power in the South China Sea with with respect to Taiwan. Um, I find it interesting. We should remember that this U.S. violent overthrow of a democratically elected president, Yanukovych, in Ukraine was over the then president's economic policy. We would have more hypothetical or theoretical reasons for a violent overthrow of Trump than they did over the violent overthrow of Yanukovych in Ukraine. And I still wonder, this is not a question, just rhetorical. I still wonder, why are France and Germany and other Western European countries willing to sacrifice themselves over being cut off from cheap Russian gas and eviscerate their industrial base in this proxy war in Ukraine? So I would say the proxy war predicated on the Western U.S. Western European proxy war was predicated on being able to cause the financial defeat or even the economic collapse of Russia. And when the Euro West couldn't cause that, then the Euro West had already lost. Russia's industrial capacity to continue their military operations cannot be defeated. My question is, Russia has 150 million people. Western Ukraine is down to around 10 million people at the most. And as I used to say, do the math. So Russia has 15 times the population base to draw upon than Western Ukraine. So the EU can pour all kinds of weapons and money into Ukraine. But unless the EU is going to put in its own troops, it won't matter. And a real
Can you
problem.
try to
Two
wrap it up real
Yeah.
minutes.
quick?
Okay, I'm finishing up right now with a sentence and a question. So a real problem is that, Western Ukrainian men don't want to be the last to die in such a war. So I'm wondering what you, Jack, have to say about this huge population difference and that Russia will not be able to be defeated on the battlefield unless the EU is willing to put in troops of its own. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the EU doesn't have troops to put in of its own. That's the bottom line here. You can talk about population comparisons and so forth, but it's a question of how much of the population is committed to active military. And Russia, its military is like 1.4 million, as I said. It's been growing some as a result, but only half, 700,000, are, as it has indicated, are in Ukraine. I don't think that's sufficient in order to go all the way to Kiev. As I've said, it's going to have to be significant, hundreds of thousands more if they want to do that. Um, Europe does not have the troops to put in, but Europe, is using the cannon fodder of the Ukraine population. And yeah, it's a much smaller population, but it appears that the draconian draft arrangements have still been able to produce headcount here, military headcount, even though they're probably not trained very well anymore, and throw them into the cauldron there of the war in the Donbass. And it appears they still have reserves, even though maybe they're having to move them from other fronts. Repeatedly they have been able to launch counteroffensives, now in East Zaporozhye and in Kupiansk and places like that. They can't sustain it in Kursk, and they are eventually overwhelmed by Russia. But Russia hasn't been able to wrap it up, so to speak, because it doesn't have sufficient resources. And I believe also Putin doesn't want to, if he doesn't have to, remobilize even more troops. I think he thought, and I don't think he thinks anymore, that maybe we can get a deal with the Americans here. Anchorage. He thought he had a deal, but Trump, reneged on that very clearly, as Lavrov has been indicating here, recently, last week in some of his presentations. So they believe Anchorage is dead, and it's becoming clear that it's all deception, as I've said. I wrote an article back in August when they had this Anchorage meeting, and the title of my article was "It's all a PR event." Not too many agreed with it because everybody wants a solution, and a little light at the end of the tunnel. And everyone thought that Trump, was serious about ending this war, but Trump isn't, and Trump does not make foreign policy by himself. American presidents in the era of the deep state now do not make foreign policy, and sometimes when they try, they get pulled back. So even if we assume Trump wanted an end to this war, the deep state and the neocons and the military-industrial complex in the U.S. and all the rest allies, they don't want an end to this war either.
If I may be permitted a one
Oh
sentence
no, actually
follow-up
we
question.
need to move on. We have to move
Okay,
on. We got
thank
eight
you.
people on the stack. Okay,
Thank you.
next is Raj, followed by Elazar. So Raj, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jack. I want to tell you that my observation of what's going on, India has actually agreed to reduce Russian oil purchases to almost zero, maybe just a little bit left, um, Modi has caved into the pressure Trump applies. And there's a tremendous amount of conflict with the opposition now. Opposition is trying to raise consciousness of the peasants and workers and all that. How far that'll go, I don't know. The trade deal they've signed is pretty disadvantageous to India. So it
Talk,
seems to
talk a
me.
little louder, Raj. I can barely hear you.
Oh, okay. So it's the trade deal is pretty disadvantageous to India. So apparently, Modi has caved in to Trump's pressure. What gives him the leverage, I don't know. But there's a big furor going on in the Indian Parliament. So, it seems like India has agreed to reduce oil purchases from Russia, although not military. So that remains to be seen. So from there, what I'm drawing the conclusion is Ukraine war is to bleed Russia and over time. So I want your assessment on that because I think it related to that is also Iran, the kind of pressures that are now applied and almost ready to attack, which is not Trump's first instinct to start a war, but he's being pushed. So could you comment on the Russia's ability to sustain a long-term bleeding both of manpower, but even more importantly, its economy? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Well, from the very beginning, the CIA and Biden, everybody, they predicated this war intensification, which Biden really intensified in 2021. By the way, that's why the U.S. got out of Afghanistan, in my opinion, so chaotically and quickly in August of 21, because immediately after that, the U.S. Began pushing Zelensky in Ukraine to be more aggressive, talk about okay, quick involvement in NATO of Ukraine, and they even started talking about nukes. It was all designed to provoke Russia, in my opinion. And they believed, the CIA and others believed that Russian economy was weak. It couldn't sustain a major and especially a long war. And even the political system, might be upended and Putin be pushed out. Now they were wrong for 4 years in that assumption, but they still believe that if we can only continue this war longer, especially the Europeans believe this, that it eventually will undermine the Russian economy, right? And you can see Russian manpower, uh, volunteers going into the Russian military, which has been significant, has put a pressure on the labor force in Russia, supply of labor force, and that's beginning to have some effect. Of course, wage increases have been running like 8-10% per year. That's a reflection of a lack of supply, right? So the longer term picture is, can Russia add 500,000 more uh, people to its military without causing severe labor shortages that really have an impact on the Russian economy, right? And therefore, inflation. For a while, the interest rates went up significantly in Russia because there was some inflationary pressures. Russian economy and GDP is doing quite well, but a lot of that is due to military production going on. And long-term military production and diversion of resources to military investment has a deleterious effect on non-military investment. It's, crowds it out a little bit. Uh, but so far, it appears to me Russia has been able to weather the economics of this. But the West believes that, 2, 3 more years it won't be able to. You see, that's their argument. Okay, but there are signs now, and they manufacture a lot of the evidence. And they believe that if they can only stop Russian oil sales, that will deny the government of financial resources to continue the war. I'm not so sure that that's true. Yeah, Russia is significantly dependent on oil sales, but even if India has cut it off, and I don't know, you know more about that than I do. that I think Russia will find other avenues, particularly China, will increase its purchases. But certainly that's the strategy of the U.S. to find new ways to squeeze Russian oil sales, whether it's India, whether it's seizing ships, right? Whether it's sanctioning Rosneft and Lukoil, for the first time really seriously. So that's all indications that the imperialists are not giving up and are intensifying. And not just the Europeans, you see. I believe this is the U.S. and Trump. They got this dual track. They're negotiating. They're like they did, in Minsk. They're sort of holding out the possibility to Russia. Just take it easy, Russia. Don't launch the big offensive. We have things that we can agree to. And we got this split with Europe. I'm not so sure there's that big a split with in NATO between the U.S. and Europe. I think some of that's a facade. Well, some of it's true. Yeah, the bottom line answer to your question is they believe, especially the Europeans, that if we can continue this 2, 3 more years, our assumption that the Russian economy will implode will occur. And who knows? Maybe even Putin won't be around by then. He's in his 70s. Who knows? So I think that's where their thinking is right now.
Okay, next is Elazar, Judith, and then Janet. So, and again, we're running up against time here, so please keep your question short. Elazar, please go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're fine. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I'd like you to integrate the following if possible. You mentioned James Baker's lie to Gorbachev, but I also believe that the goal of U.S. imperialism that Baker elucidated was to break Russia up into sub-regions, as many as 7 controllable sub-regions. And the NATOization, I'd like you to integrate the NATOization of the Ukraine to it as the final dangerous leak that provoked Putin, the 2014 coup, which you mentioned, but you didn't mention, as far as the sound went off for a short while, so you may have the role of neo-Nazis in the government and perhaps behind the Maidan massacre. So there are several areas I'd like you to tie together in one knot so that because the groups that I work with, we took a critical support to the Russian intervention into Ukraine as forced upon them by the expansion of NATO and particularly the NATOization and fascization of the Ukraine right on their border, which they returned to the Ukraine under Khrushchev. Okay, thank you very much. Excellent presentation.
Yeah. Well, as far as James Baker is concerned, the U.S. clearly back then in 89, 90, 91 had a policy of really enticing Russia to not to resist the movement of NATO East, and they promised. There's letters, documentation now from Baker to Gorbachev and Yeltsin and so forth. They promised that, and they held out and delivered. The U.S. held out and delivered the fig leaf, the plum here of nuclear agreements. That's when you got START and the INF and even ABM agreements. So, Russia at a point of being, internal disruptions and weak, the collapse of the Soviet Union, pretty much saw these agreements as a reasonable quid pro quo at the time, right? And they believed that the assurances that NATO would not move east, and probably under the old guard, Baker and those, it would not have. It was only in the 90s, as I pointed out, with the rise of the neocons, that that policy changed, particularly under Clinton, who was very weak after the impeachment, and they could do whatever they want with him. And he gave the neocons whatever they want, and he gave the big bankers whatever they want. He just totally capitulated to stay in office, as the way I see it, after 98, 99. Okay. So when you get to your second point, with the neo-Nazi involvement, well, it was significant in the 2014 coup. And it was admitted pretty much by Victoria Nuland when, she said the CIA spent $5 billion pretty much funding these radical right-wing groups. Neo-Nazis, obviously. Nazism has been very strong in Western Ukraine for decades, even before World War II. That was a hotbed of fascist organization, and it still is. And the U.S. and CIA used them as shock troops. I won't get into everything that happened at Maidan here in 2014, but very, very clearly that was manipulated by the U.S. and the CIA, and then Newland pretty much selected who the government was going to be,
Yeah.
and that's been revealed too. So yeah, I mean they are a force, and that's always been part of Russia's demands here that you denazify the government, whatever that means. As part of the solution, any kind of solution, and you reduce the military to 80, 100,000 instead of its 7, 800,000, whatever it is now, right? And no NATO. Those are all primary June 24 demands by Putin, which are still Russia's position right now, and none of which Zelensky is willing to agree to, including giving up any of the land here in the east. So that's why there's no negotiations possible with Zelensky in Ukraine, especially if the Europeans are backing him and if the U.S. is playing this hard cop, soft cop role of second track negotiations here. It's all about keeping the thing going, in my opinion.
Okay, Judith, followed by Janet. So please go ahead, Judith, and we'll let you know when you're unmuted.
I'm unmuted.
You're unmuted. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So, yeah, Russia has a population problem, and they are importing a very large number of Indians for their labor force. I'm just mentioning that, but the thing I wanted to ask you about was I didn't read this in the news, but people are saying that the Chinese have decided to give humanitarian aid to the Ukraine, and that would include things for their heating system and all the infrastructure that the Russians destroyed just recently. So I wonder if you could comment on that. Is it a canard or is it true?
Well, I have no information on that. What trade content is between China and Ukraine. So I really couldn't add any reasoned opinion on that at the moment. Uh, Unfortunately, I don't know. There's a lot of trade back and forth, and some of it is obfuscated as to what it actually is. And then you got Western propaganda that tends to, exaggerate certain things. So I really have no comment on that.
Okay, Janet, please unmute and go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Jack. I thought I'd just mention that when you talked about the CIA droning in Russia, you said it was over Trump's residence in
Oh, excuse me. No, excuse me. No, it was on Putin's residence. Thank you for the correction.
Um, and well, somewhat related to that, to me, there's been a change in the nature of so-called negotiations by the US overall, with Trump's style of really trying to make business deals rather than treaties. And on top of that, using gunboat diplomacy, even terrorist diplomacy. Um, in any case, yeah. Here's my question, separate from that. I'm wondering what your take is on both Ukraine's and Russia's relationships with Israel, especially with Zelensky being a Zionist Jew who supports Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the long-term Zionist influence in Russia?
Yeah, well, I don't really know. I can comment that much. I know Russia maintains relationships, diplomatic relationships with Israel and has. What
Ukraine.
role they're playing right now is unclear. I think they probably don't have much influence over Israel. Uh, we
How
do
about
know that.
the other direction?
Oh, Israel's influence. So I really don't know. I would think that there would be some Zionist influence in Russia. I mean, just look at the influence here in the U.S. I mean, it's very deep and intense, both at the congressional level and at the executive branch level. Uh, Netanyahu gets whatever he wants when he comes to the U.S. And it just really irks me when I see uh, people who are citizens of Israel in the U.S. Congress wearing IDF uniforms. I mean, that just sort of just I don't know how we tolerate that. But that's we all know it's very deep influence, including U.S. very rich billionaire Zionists. I mean, I'm talking about the Ellisons and the Adelsons and so forth. They pretty much pull Trump strings whenever they want to. Uh, so I really don't know how I could comment, and I won't comment on Zionist influence in Russia, but if it's so deep in the U.S. and it's pretty damn deep in the UK, I suspect there's some influence there.
Okay, we'll go with Peter, followed by Claudio. So, Peter, please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great conversation. Thanks very much, Dr. Rasmus. It's really, I've struggled to find anything I really disagree with you. I liked your analysis of going all the way back to the 90s to really, or even, World War II, of course, to dig into the origin of this conflict. I do have a different perspective on what you call the insufficient troops that Russia has and therefore can't actually prosecute a military victory. I'm kind of at a loss on that. I've listened to all experts. I'm not an expert in any way, but listened to all the military, officers to comment on this. Colonel Davis, uh, you know, Colonel Douglas McGregor, Colonel Wilkerson, uh, Ukrainian generals that are, talking about the massive numbers of Russian troops along the front. Uh, CIA analysts, Larry Johnson, Ray McGovern. I mean, I can go on and on. John Mearsheimer. I have yet to hear anybody take this position that troops are insufficient, that 750,000 troops, about 400,000 of which are on the contact line and probably 250, 300,000 in reserve. They're sitting there in reserve and rotating, of course. And while they also build out the number of troops in the European borderlands, Finland, et cetera. So I don't hear anybody saying that they have insufficient troops. Certainly, the 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 type of war that we have now, you can't have large concentrations. Like you said, those that concentrate troops wins, but I
Uh,
think those
two
those that
minutes.
yeah,
2 minutes.
those that concentrate troops in any location lose, they get attacked. So it's very, very sparse front line. So anyway, I don't see that, and I'm wondering, who, in your view, is there anybody else that has, is also saying that Russia has insufficient troops? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'm aware of the views of all the people you reference, and I have great respect for all of them. They're great analysts of what's going on. Uh, I know my position may not be totally popular with that perspective, but I'm just looking at it objectively, and the fact that 700,000 troops are obviously probably going to be sufficient to liberate those four oblasts. I think that's sufficient. But short of a collapse of the Ukrainian military, which doesn't appear to be collapsing. It is severely depleted, that's for sure, and it's uncertain how long it can go on. Uh, but I still see them mounting counteroffensives that aren't sustained. They can't. The counteroffensives cannot be sustained, and they do this with great sacrifice to their men and material for political reasons, to raise money in Europe again, and so forth. These are political counteroffensives. But short of the collapse of the Ukraine military, which could happen fairly quickly, I don't think from a pure military point of view that 700,000 is sufficient to go all the way to the Dnieper River, which has to occur to end this war militarily. Very clearly, Russia has to absorb other areas like Kharkov and Sumy and even Dnipro provinces. And then there's some talk about Odessa. I don't think they have the forces to go into Odessa. Uh, that would be a very difficult, very, very intense conflict. And you got to keep in mind that, NATO is building its largest military base throughout NATO, 75 miles from Odessa in eastern Romania. I mean, that's for a reason, right? I mean, it's even bigger than Ramstein, okay? Um, so I just don't see where they have the forces to prevail to that extent, which is necessary to end the war militarily, because it's not going to be ended by negotiations. They have to end it militarily. And that's going to take at least 500,000 more troops, but that's very difficult for Russia to raise 500,000 more troops, although they could, right? A lot of volunteers, they could. Um, Without really putting further pressure on their economy. And that's probably why NATO and others want to continue the conflict. They force Russia to engage even more resources in order to prevail. Their idea of a victory is just to continue the thing, let it fester and continue for 2, 3, 4 more years, because Europe needs it, as I've said many times before, to justify its remilitarization and the cost that would mean on the social safety net in Europe, which would be stripped, look more like the U.S. Uh, if they got away with it. I'm just looking at it objectively, and then you throw in the fact of modern warfare. Uh, Russia is beating the hell out of Ukraine's economy, right, and its energy system. But air wars never win wars. Eventually, you have to take territory, And a lot of the people you refer to say, "Oh no, this is a war of debilitating Ukraine resources. That Russia really doesn't care about land. Russia wants to, debilitate in conflicts all the Ukraine military." Yeah, there's some truth to that. But eventually, you're going to have to go to the Dnieper if you want to get rid of that government, right? And that government's propped up now, and it still has significant cannon fodder, and it's still getting weapons from Europe and the U.S. I don't. I see a continuation of the slog, the military slog in the East. Russia will continue taking key cities, Konstantinivka, Slavyansk, Kupiansk, and in Zaporozhye and so forth. But it's going to take another year in my opinion, militarily to really capture all of the oblasts, and then who knows where it's going to go in 2027. But Europe and Ukraine and the U.S., I think, certain interests in the U.S. Uh, see the continuation of the conflict militarily with a lot of negotiations, deceptions along the way as the solution to, they believe, an eventual collapse of Russia economically and militarily. So their excuse is that the Russia after 4 years hasn't overrun all of Ukraine, right? Well, once again, professional, this is the last comment on that. Professional armies. Everybody's got a professional army today, right? These aren't the armies of World War II, huge numbers of draftees and stuff. They're all professional and they're all about the same size, right? I mean, Russia's 1.4 million, the US is 1.3 million, China is just under 2 million. These are all professional armies. And when professional armies get into a conflict, given the new technology, it's very hard for one or the other to prevail. It's easy to prevail a professional army against some, smaller country that is not technologically and whatever able to defend itself, whether that be Venezuela or Iran even or whatever, right? It's easy. But professional armies, when they both meet now, given the technological nature of warfare, it becomes a slog, in my opinion. That's just my
Okay,
view.
last two questioners, Claudio and then Jim, and then we'll wrap this up. So Claudio, please go ahead. Keep your question short.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say something about Lavrov's comments on the U.S. absorption of Greenland. It didn't sit well with me, and I wanted to know what you thought. I don't know what Russia's position is on this, and it seems like on some points Russia diverges from what we think is right, our point in geopolitics. And this was one of them that surprised me. I really was shocked by Russia's reaction to hands off on Greenland, but then they've said contradictory things. Can you clarify?
Yeah, it is contradictory. On one level, I'm sure they like to see the conflict between the U.S. and European NATO. Right? This thing seems to be provoking, right? On the other hand, Russia probably doesn't want to see the U.S. Develop an Arctic strategy to neutralize its own Arctic offensive going on. So you get contradictory views, and then there's negotiations, and they try to play to Trump, placate him, whatever. So they're all over the map with contradictory. I don't think they really have a position, fundamental position on Greenland themselves. They have these conflicting positions.
Okay, last question is Jim, if you would please unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly, as you've talked about many times in terms of Russia's position, the term I keep hearing from Lavrov is root causes. And the impression I got was that somehow or other in Alaska, Trump gave the impression that he would address root causes. Because as far as I can see, Putin and Lavrov are absolutely dedicated not to quitting fighting until root causes is addressed, meaning what we referred to, NATO's lies and moving eastward and all that. So that's something, that I'm observing. Second of all, I think it's very interesting that China has put in solar panels into Cuba, now amounting for 20% of the electric generation. This seems to be a different approach than trying to push back on getting oil there. And do you see any evidence this is going to be expanded? Thank you.
Yeah, I think China and Russia are going to do whatever they can to prevent Cuba from collapsing. It's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next 6 months. Can they, restore Cuba's energy grid to some extent as the U.S. chokes off, all of Cuba? That's going to be interesting to see over the next 12 months. But there is an attempt to do something there as best they could. Your first question was about Greenland or what? Oh no, your first question was about Russian security. Russia wants a security agreement too. Russia very clearly, this is existential for Russia. Russia will not give up because if they do, the days are numbered. They will be broken up eventually. The U.S. wants to restore the complete domination of Russia that it had during the 90s when Russia was in the severe depression as a result of U.S. policy. They want to restore that, right? And this time they probably want to break it up if they can, particularly the southern tier. The U.S. and the CI is very active in Armenia and Azerbaijan right now, especially Azerbaijan, along with Mossad and the Israelis. And whatever happens when they attack Iran, there will be probably a northern front, Kurds and Azerbaijan involved in trying to disrupt the government. Um, but Russia wants some long-term security agreement because it is increasingly convinced that this NATO war is a preliminary to Europe in general attacking it, 3, 4 years from now. And, maybe that's why they're not expending all their military resources all at once here. They got to hold something in reserve here, whether it's the Oreshniks and new technologies or, the possibility of mobilizing 1 million more men or whatever. They got that other eye on Europe, and the Germans talking about we're going to war in 3 years, right? As they got another eye on Ukraine and what to do there. And they have limited military resources. They're significant, but they're not unlimited. So I think they're rationing. They're rationing their military forces as best they can in Ukraine. And of course, that means that you don't get a total conquest military of Ukraine, because I think they probably believe that if we can devastate it enough economically, by destroying its infrastructure and debilitating its military forces, that eventually they'll come to their senses and they'll agree to something. I think that's what the Russian strategy is. Keep the pressure on, but not throw all your resources into Ukraine to bring this thing to an immediate conclusion, because who knows what you're going to need 3 years from now. And I think that's the strategy. But on the NATO side, the strategy is, oh, we can keep this thing going. We can keep throwing in weapons. We can keep pushing Ukrainians to die. There's still 500,000 more. So both sides, it's an attrition. It's an attrition conflict right now. Uh, Europe can't bring it to an end, and I don't think Russia could. It could, but I don't think it really wants to throw in all its cards to do that. It's got to look at the longer term. So that's my analysis of why things aren't going, quickly in Ukraine. Russia's going to wait and see and continue its strategy to see whether they do give up at some point. Maybe even in Europe, you'll have a change in governments, and Europe will back off this crazy idea of remilitarizing and attacking Russia long term. That's a possibility, a significant possibility. And so Russia is, in my opinion, is weighing all of these longer terms, different geographies, and so forth. And it's got to support Iran for the war coming there. What kind of resources will be diverted there? Who knows? So that's why I have the analysis I do, which is kind of not along the lines of the McGregors and the Daniel Davises. That this is attrition, and and the other side that says, the CIA side that says, we can continue fighting for 3, 4 years.
Thank you, Jack. You can get more content from Jack at his website, jackrasmus.com. I would also recommend subscribing to Alternate Visions, which is a weekly podcast, which really gets into a lot of great detail about what's going on in the U.S. economy. I want to also thank the participants in today's discussion. Some great questions, really good questions. We want to invite everybody back for next week to hear what will be a very interesting discussion about China, sort of an on-the-ground travelogue observations tied into some of the bigger questions about what's the nature of Chinese society and economy. Go to our website at icssmarks.org, sign up for email notifications of future programs, and if you can, please drop us a line with suggestions and make a donation. So with that, we're going to go ahead and thank you very much, Jack, for joining us today and for your excellent presentation. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And